Okay, Rija, you can start.
Yes. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to the Day 2 proceedings of the 14th All India Conference of China Studies, organized by the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, in collaboration with China Bhavan, Vishwa Bharati University, and in partnership with the India office of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. We shall now begin the proceedings of Day 2 with a special panel on the topic China's influence in India and South Asia, put together by our colleagues at the Center for Social and Economic Progress. Chairing this panel is Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, Visiting Professor of International Relations, Ashoka University, Distinguished Fellow, Center for Social and Economic Progress, and Chairman of the Advisory Board, Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. The speakers in this panel include Mr. Amish Rajmulmi, author of All Roads Lead North, Nepal's Turn to China, published in 2021. He'll be speaking on the topic Charm Offensive, Shaping Chinese Perceptions in Nepal. Dr. Antara Ghosal Singh, former Research Associate, Center for Social and Economic Progress, New Delhi, who will be speaking on the topic China's approach to South Asia, characteristics and lessons. Dr. Shulani Atanayake, Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, speaking on the topic China's Buddhist influence in Sri Lanka. And finally, Ms. Shehtaj Mahmood, Senior Coordinator, Projects and Program, the Institute of Policy, Advocacy and Governance, Dhaka, who will be speaking on Myanmar's Rohingya crisis and China's growing clout in Bangladesh. To lead the discussion, we have with us Dr. Constantino Xavier, Fellow in Foreign Policy and Security Studies at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, New Delhi. Before I invite the chair to begin the proceedings, let me lay out the housekeeping rules. All participants, except the speakers, will be muted for the duration of the event. Participants are requested to send in their queries via the chat box or use the raise hand option. Please unmute yourself only when called upon to do so by the chair. I will now invite the chair to begin the proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Rija. Thank you very much. And welcome, everybody. Welcome to this special panel on China's influence in India and South Asia. We at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, CSEP, have been running a project for some time on China's influence in the subcontinent. And where we examine China's growing role, but across a range of sectors, not just the government-to-government relationship, but in education, media, public diplomacy, technology, social media, civil society, religion, governance, and so on. And we've been doing this, the methodology we followed is to work with colleagues, partners, scholars across the sub-region, across the subcontinent. And quite frankly, even though I say it myself, I was very impressed by the quality of what we in the region, in the sub-region, are capable of producing. And I think we have 4 excellent panelists today, as you just heard from Rija, to introduce the subject and to start our discussions off. And following their presentations, 10 to 12 minutes each, we will then turn to Constantino Xavier as our chief discussant to comment on the presentations. And after that, I'll open up the floor to everybody. There's 2 ways that you can participate in the discussion, ask questions. One, by raising your hand, or by typing your questions in the chat box, which I will then relay or ask you to ask yourself if you prefer. So we'll go on till 11:30. I'm looking forward to the presentations. Let's start with Dr. Amish Rajmulmi, who will speak on the Charm Offensive, Shaping Chinese Perceptions in Nepal. Amish, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon and AICCS for having me over. Good morning, everyone. My paper is titled Charm Offensive, Shaping Chinese Perceptions in Nepal. This is a qualitative study of how China has come to be perceived in the country, how its mission enacts its public diplomacy outreach, and what such soft diplomacy practices tell us about how China views itself and wants the world to view it. While much of the recent focus on China and Nepal has been on its newfound political and economic influence, a study along these lines alone is not adequate to fully describe this bilateral relationship. Ties were elevated to a strategic partnership during Chinese President Xi Jinping's October 2019 visit, indicating that the current relationship is favorable to China's end goals in Nepal, despite relatively low levels of economic investments and strategic value. To this end, I argue, it is important to understand how China frames its public diplomacy and soft power approach in Nepal, not just because they provide a different framework in understanding China's foreign policy goals, but also because such initiatives call for a different imagination of bilateral ties beyond a security or economic-led perspective, which China has employed successfully in its dealings with developing countries across the world. My first argument is that China has made itself increasingly visible in Nepal after 2008, the year Nepal became a republic. Until then, the Shah monarchy had been regarded as a permanent establishment in the country, and after its ouster, China needed new friends, so it extensively began to reach out to political parties and the Nepali establishment. 2008 was also when Tibetan exiles protested the Beijing Olympics in Kathmandu. The new Chinese engagement in Nepal was thus also predicated on halting all political expressions by the Tibetan exiled community inside the country and curtailing the passage of new Tibetan nationals into Nepal. Such engagement has now also come to mean imposing restrictions over Tibetan exiles entering Nepal from other countries, as in June 2019. So in 2008, the then Chinese ambassador was asked in an interview, why does China conduct a low-profile diplomacy in Nepal as compared to other influential nations? Looking back, the question was right for its time, but in 2021, it could not be further from the truth. Chinese ambassadors have increasingly been more visible in the years since, especially in the spheres of public diplomacy. In 2020, Chinese Ambassador Hu Yanqi gave at least 6 interviews to the Nepali media and wrote 5 articles for Nepali newspapers. In 2021, the ambassador has so far written 4 op-eds on China's COVID-19 vaccine support to Nepal and on the 50th anniversary of China regaining its spot in the United Nations, and given at least 4 interviews to the Nepali media, besides an online press conference on the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party. Besides these outreach programs, the Chinese embassy in Nepal has also stepped up its public diplomacy. Beyond the ambassador's social media presence, Chinese soft powers emphasize through exhibitions, events, and cultural programs. Some instances are the ambassador dancing to a Nepali song with the embassy colleagues on the occasion of Women's Day in 2019, asking her followers to retweet her to get tickets for a Chinese film festival, posting pictures of herself at various tourist sites to promote Visit Nepalia 2020, singing a popular Nepali folk song on the occasion of Dasai, the festival, and celebrating the festival in Nepali tradition with her embassy colleagues, comparing the similarities between Chinese and Nepali cultures, such as calling the Lantern Festival a Chinese Tihar or Diwali in Indian terms, and posting a video of embassy colleagues making jiaozi dumplings that are similar to the popular momos. And finally, a call out for videos on the theme of China's story around me, with the disclaimer to not include any politics in the videos. Such public outreach programs positively reinforce ties between the two countries, emphasizing shared cultures and place the overall bilateral relationship in a framework of mutual respect and trust. Such public diplomacy also comes into renewed focus with Xi Jinping's emphasis in 2013 on cultural cooperation and people-to-people exchanges as a key element of Beijing's foreign policy, especially in neighboring countries. The second point I then make is that such public diplomacy tools tell us how China asserts its narrative on sovereignty and diplomacy in a time of great power contest. In Nepal, this has been done in 2 ways. The first is by emphasizing its narrative on Tibet's peaceful liberation, on its feudal past, and on the material and economic progress on the plateau since the PRC's arrival in 1950. This is done through exhibitions such as the Tibet of China, Past and Present photo exhibition in 2009, which is designed to show, and I quote, Tibet is in its best period of historical development after its 50-year reform, end quote. In November 2019, I visited the China's Tibet Trade Fair, where the emphasis on China's Tibet was quite unmissable. Nepal's adherence to the One China policy is also repeated in every joint statement. And similarly, while Buddhism is held up as a cultural bridge, historical ties are rarely imagined within the ambit of Tibetan Buddhism or the Dalai Lama. Such exhibits intend to steer the public narrative about Tibet away from that of the Tibetan government in exile. Thus, While the Tibetan geography shapes contemporary bilateral discourse via the infrastructure projects that have come down from Tibet into Nepal, and Tibetan history with Nepal is recalled to give continuity to bilateral relations, the emphasis on semantics such as China's Tibet ensure these exhibits and other cultural diplomacy efforts are in line with Beijing's version of Tibet and emphasize its sovereignty over the plateau. China then shapes its relations with Nepal via Tibetan geography and a history that it finds suitable, but not via the Tibetan identity. The COVID-19 pandemic best exemplified the second manner in which the Chinese narrative was asserted in the country. Nepal was part of two multilateral conferences which rejected politicizing the pandemic. While China's supply of vaccines has been regularly held up as an example of friendship in line with its foreign policy goal of a community of common destiny, the Chinese ambassador has also repeatedly asserted in op-eds and media appearances that Chinese vaccine aid was not motivated by any ulterior geopolitical motives. At the July press conference, the ambassador remarked that, and I quote, developing countries, including Nepal, also provide support to China within their capabilities, actively speak for China on international and multilateral occasions, resolutely oppose some countries' smear against China on issues such as human rights and origin tracing of COVID-19 virus, end quote. This brings me to my third and final argument, that the Chinese ambassador's invocation of multilateralism as the core concept of the current international system and order is based on Beijing's perceptions that the current international narrative has not been kind to her, and thus she must, in Xi Jinping's words, tell China's story well. As a recent US Department of Defense report on the military capabilities of China suggested, China, in open quote, emphasizes solidarity and cooperation with developing countries with the end goal of acquiring their support within international organizations. In Nepal, this has been reflected in attaining its support on issues that matter to China, such as the One China policy, its position on Hong Kong and Xinjiang, and as I mentioned earlier, on the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. More recently, China's narrative push in Nepal is also reflected in its insistence on the joint announcement of the new height of Everest, or Chomolungma, as China likes to call the peak. China regards the name Everest as a colonial relic and argues Qing-era surveyors had first mapped the peak in the early 18th century, preceding British colonial attempts by at least 130 years. The decision to share the peak as a common boundary between Nepal and China was also a political decision agreed to in 1961. And the recent joint announcement of the new height was a culmination of a 15-year quest from the Chinese side. Nepal had disagreed with Chinese measurements in 2005. It was during Xi Jinping's 2019 visit to Kathmandu that the two countries agreed to announce the new height together, although Nepal had already begun to conduct its own surveys in 2017. So to conclude, China's emphasis on soft diplomacy through its public outreach programs, through its assertions of sovereignty over Tibet, and through its quest to co-opt Nepal in shaping the international narrative positively towards China, positively reinforces friendly bilateral ties that are often viewed in contrast to Nepal-India ties. Further, China's rising influence in Nepal is predicated, unlike in other developing nations, not on its economic investments, which are still fewer and lesser in value as compared to other South Asian countries, or as a strategic asset, but as a political and economic alternative to other powers. And finally, with such outreach programs, China attempts to win the hearts and minds of the Nepali public and intelligentsia, by itself not an easy task in a politically fractious and intellectually partisan country such as Nepal. At the same time, these soft power initiatives also tell us how China molds its foreign policy in its neighborhood and with developing countries in general. In seeking Nepal's acquiescence on issues that matter to it, and in attempting to create a counter-narrative on issues such as Tibet and Everest, China is defining the contours of how it views the world and how it would like the world to view it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Amish. I'll now turn to Antara Ghosal Singh, who will speak on China's approach to South Asia, the characteristics and lessons of it. Antara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I would like to share the presentation, the PPT that I have. If you may kindly confirm if you can see the PPT.
Yeah, I can see it.
Great. Just a moment. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, good morning, everyone. And thank you, ICS, for organizing this very important session on China and South Asia. And I'm really honored to be a part of this eminent panel today. My paper, as Ambassador Menon mentioned, is about China's approach to South Asia. And in this paper, I will try to answer some of the how and why questions of China's recent activism in the South Asia region. And this paper is particularly based on reading of Chinese language resources. Importance of South Asia in Chinese scheme of things is self-evident. This is the only region in the world where China has planned 3 major land corridors and 1 maritime corridor. This is the region which has the maximum number of China's early harvest projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. China has proposed several free trade agreements with countries in the region, which are in various stages of development. So connecting the East and West, North and South, and linking the sea and land, South Asia enjoys a pivotal position in China's Belt and Road Initiative among all the other 4 Asias. Over the last decade, China has developed a greater variety of interest and deeper connection with the countries in the region than ever before. Various new platforms, mechanisms like China South Asia Expo, China South Asia Think Tank Forum, China South Asia Technology Transfer and Innovation Cooperation Conference, and so on and so forth have been introduced to strengthen China's ties with the region. And all these indicate that in the past few years, the position of South Asia has climbed up significantly in the Chinese strategic outlay. What are the goals driving China's South Asia policy? China says, and many scholars from our region reiterates, that it is to carry out the true development of South Asia while liberating the region from the tyranny of what they call Indian unipolarity or hegemony. So is China's long-term strategic interest in the region all about indulging in a costly battle for allies and partners? Is it about providing free public goods to the South Asian nations and outcompete India and other powers as their key economic development partner? A look at Chinese language literature on South Asia reveals that it is not quite the case. In fact, Chinese strategists often resent being seen as a cash cow in the region, and they refer to the overzealous and overcompeting political forces in various South Asian countries as mythical, as like Chinese a mythical monster, that's what they say, vying to pounce on Chinese riches and generosity. They often caution against China getting into excessive competition with India and other external powers in the region, of repeating the Southeast Asia mistake of getting the South Asian nations relying on China for economic growth and India and others for security, which they say will increase China's cost of engagement with diminishing returns. They further advise to avoid the emergence of strategic competition pattern in the region with the US and India, among others, on one side, and China, Pakistan, and others on the other side, which they believe will be completely inconsistent with China's strategic goals in the region, and cause China's diplomatic resources in South Asia to be consumed for a long time in irrelevant conflicts and frictions. So, what are China's long-term strategic goals in the region? My study of Chinese writings on the issue reveals that by venturing into South Asia, China is seeking to overcome 2 imbalances in its economy caused by the export-oriented growth model, which has been instrumental in its rise in the past decades. First is the serious imbalance in China's domestic economic development, the development gap between the coast and the inland region, where the development level of coastal areas is significantly higher than the development level of the inland areas, threatening China's social stability and national cohesion. And secondly, it is to address what it calls, Qingqi da Wan Hui Hua, or coastalization of its economy, causing high degree of dependence on sea trade and foreign economies and foreign resources. The key reason behind China's Malacca dilemma or South China Sea conundrum. So, as part of Chinese analysis, South Asia has a unique geopolitical pattern of stars surrounding the moon or central peripheral structure, which presents characteristics of imbalance and fracture. China sees opportunity in the fact that India's dominance in the region is not complete. The perennially tensed India-Pakistan relation always keeps China relevant in the region. Secondly, India still lacks sufficient resources to provide other South Asian countries with public products needed for their development. At the same time, there is no inherent mechanism in South Asia that allows India's development dividend to spill over to the broader region. Therefore, India's unrivaled superiority or leadership position is not fully recognized by South Asian countries psychologically, and they tend to choose to balance India to varying degrees instead of complying with India's policies. In this context, China, with its enhanced strength and status at the global level, sees possibility of influencing the construction of a new regional order in South Asia, which is more favorable to its interest. However, there are challenges too. The asymmetric power structure in the region means that India enjoys an unparalleled geographical advantage in the region, forms the center or the core of South Asia, while other countries are loosely distributed around India and are not connected to each other. This objectively prevents China or smaller or medium countries of South Asia to organize themselves with or without the help of China against India so as to address the power imbalance in the region. China's physical connection with Pakistan is also of little value in this regard, as it remains geographically, culturally, somewhat cut off from the rest of South Asia. The other key challenge that China faces in this region is the complex and divided political landscape in the South Asian nations. Chinese side remain particularly frustrated about the perennial cycle of suspension, cancellation, and price increase of the Chinese investment initiatives in South Asian countries. The Chinese side often blames it on the immature democracy, that is what they call immature democracies in South Asia, with unstable, polarized, fragmented political environment topped by a complex religious, ethnic, and cultural setting. They argue that on one hand, the divided politics in these countries gave India an undue advantage in interfering or influencing affairs within this region, reshuffling the political cards as per its interest, and even dragging, delaying, or impacting China's advancement at a relatively small cost. On the other hand, the India factor often becomes a potent tool in the hands of the other countries in South Asia to raise objections, renegotiate, bargain hard with Beijing, ultimately raising the cost of China's cooperation projects by manyfold. In the Chinese strategic outlay, South Asian nations are segregated into various categories, and China has chalked out corresponding strategies to deal with members of each category. First is the high dependence category. This category comprises of countries like particularly Nepal and Bhutan in the Himalayas. It is argued that due to geographical and historical reasons, they rely heavily on India, and their economic lifeline somewhat remains in India's hand. Secondly, semi-dependence. The second category comprises countries like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Maldives. Factors such as geographic proximity, living habits, and cultural exchanges, bilateral free trade agreement are seen as some of the important reasons behind these countries' dependence on India. But on the other hand, they are located in the main transportation routes in the Indian Ocean. Therefore, they have an advantage in geographic location and have certain ability to withstand India's influence. Thirdly, the comparative independence category, which comprises of Afghanistan and Pakistan on the western front of on the western side of the South Asian region. Since India and Pakistan share a complex relationship and Afghanistan does not share border with India, the region has comparatively less dependency on India. But given the serious contradiction between Afghanistan and Pakistan, India stays, remains an important factor here as well. And now the corresponding strategies. China has clear-cut strategies to deal with each category. First is no big-ticket investment, big project cooperation with high dependence category. Only developing softer cooperation that builds China's image and are low risk in nature. While China wants Nepal or Bhutan to come out of India's shadow, but it is unsure if it can replace India's role in these countries' development trajectory, particularly since China's own economic centers remain far away from these countries and its main economic force still is facing east rather than west. Um, Chinese strategists often warn against over-agitating India or over these countries as it can prove counterproductive, causing strong backlash from India, hampering the interest of these countries as well as impacting China-India relations. Therefore, it is argued that the best way to promote cooperation with these countries is to focus on softer issues, cultural exchange projects, tourism cooperation, and so on and so forth, are seen as the key content of cooperation between China and these countries. Secondly, the strategy is about developing broad-based ties with semi-dependent countries to weaken their dependence factor on India. This is to be achieved by not just focusing on the state actors, but also reaching out to various stakeholders, encouraging sub-state actors and non-governmental actors to actively participate and play a role in generating positive public opinion of China in these countries. Thirdly, given the comparative independence of Afghanistan-Pakistan region, these nations are mostly seen as a stepping stone for carrying out China's future plans in the region. And finally, the idea is to develop cooperation with South Asia as a whole under a multinational framework, a multilateral framework headed by China. In this regard, China had very much interest in becoming a full member of SAARC, but now since SAARC is off the table, it is in the lookout for a new multilateral forum to bring South Asian countries together under China's leadership. Finally, coming to India's role in China's South Asia strategy, it is well understood in China that for both its strategic objectives in South Asia, be it the Western development strategy or its interest to diversify from over-reliance on sea trade or particular overseas markets, access to Indian market and close physical and economical connectivity between China and India is crucial. In other words, India remained the prime target, the core node country of China's South Asia strategy. But given the complicated relation between the two, China understands the difficulty in getting India on board for its Belt and Road strategy, as well as other plans for the region. Some Chinese scholars are therefore of the opinion that, they argue that by openly acknowledging India's special strategic value or its central role in China's South Asia and Indian Ocean strategy is going to be counterproductive. It will only add on to India's confidence and arrogance, and less likely it will be for China to gain any support from India. Accordingly, it has devised a step-by-step approach for South Asia that is easiest or the friendliest first. As part of this strategy, China uses multiple entry points of facades, take various strategic detours, and build up various high-profile demonstration projects, is what they call, despite the lack of economic viability. It carries out power projection actions, both at the LSE as well as in the Indian Ocean region, to build up pressure on India and to compel it to give in to Chinese demands. So I'll stop at that and look forward to your views and feedback from all my co-panelists and the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antara. Thank you very much for that. I'll now turn the floor over to Chulani Attanayake, who will speak on China's Buddhist influence in Sri Lanka. Antara, you'll have to stop screen sharing.
Yes, sorry.
Chulani, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon, and thank you for ICS for the invitation for this conference. also for CSEP for the invitation to be a part of the project. Ambassador Menon informed at the beginning of this panel. So the paper I'm presenting today is a first draft for the said project. And so I really value the feedback and comments that I will be getting from my co-panelists and the audience. So the topic is on China's Buddhist influence in Sri Lanka. China and Sri Lanka shares historical Buddhist connection. So this paper, however, tried to analyze how China is using this connection in the contemporary manner and whether China has actually managed to use it as a soft power tool in Sri Lanka. Since opening up, China has experienced a rapid ascent to global power status, as we know. And so China sees the period since the late 1990s as the most important period of its strategic opportunity to set the tone for its global rise. Given how power transition is often viewed as a threat to global security and stability, China attempts to portray its rise as benign and peaceful. So the Chinese Communist Party has gradually adopted soft power strategies to facilitate this. And the soft power is viewed as a critical element in achieving China's long-term strategic objective. Since the late 1990s, the Chinese strategic studies community has been referring to the concept of soft power, and the term has often appeared in a plethora of academic research, official government pronouncements, newspapers, etc. However, China's power projection in other parts of the world is usually analyzed through the lens of hard power. Because of its excessive use of economic and other strategic tools. So in this regard, in this paper, I'm trying to, even when you're discussing about Sri Lanka's China's role in Sri Lanka, it's the same. You usually look at it from the hard power lens. But in this paper, I'm trying to look at it through the soft power lens. In recent years, China has emphasized on faith diplomacy or its religious connections with countries in near and far periphery. Particularly, China uses Buddhist history and Buddhist links to augment its influence in South and Southeast Asian region. It is actively engaged in promoting Buddhism internationally. For instance, it is involved in the Common Text project undertaken by the International Council of Day of Vesak under the stewardship of Maha Chulalongkorn University in Thailand. It is active in international Buddhist organizations such as World Fellowship of Buddhists and World Buddhist Forum. It has hosted the 5th session of World Buddhist Forum in 2018 in Fujian. The list goes on in the way how it engages with the Buddhist countries in the South and Southeast Asia. China using Buddhism as a tool of soft power is not the first time a country uses religion as a tool of soft power. For instance, countries in the Middle East use Islam propagation activities in the pursuit of foreign policy objective. Russia uses Orthodox Church to expand its cultural and political influence. And India, especially under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, is using Buddhism as an important tool of soft power. But what is unique for China is how it uses this faith diplomacy or Buddhism despite being a self-proclaimed atheist country. During the post-Mao era, Beijing employed Buddhism as a diplomatic tool to engage with South Korea and Japan, and China even organized Buddhist-friendly interaction conferences between these three countries. But the way that China engages with the Sri Lankan Buddhist community is relatively a new phenomenon. Since BRI gathered momentum, China has accelerated the use and mobilizing Buddhist diplomacy in Sri Lanka. and it has been sharing the Sri Lanka and China's historical Buddhist sites. So China there are not much, compared to what my previous panelist explained on Nepal, in Sri Lanka, there are no much information on how China has been using Buddhist diplomacy to a very large extent. But the information what is available shows a definite increase in the use of using Buddhist ties to propagate soft power. For instance, China uses, from my data I have gathered, there are several activities that China continuously uses in building its Buddhist connection with Sri Lanka. One is exchange of Buddhist delegations between the two countries. Second is sponsoring exhibitions and conferences that highlight Buddhist relationship and connectivity. And the third is engagement with the Buddhist community through associations. And finally, the use of symbolic infrastructure that shows its Buddhist connectivity. So to begin with, on how the exchanges of Buddhist delegation has happened, in 2015, an exchange program organized by the Chinese Embassy in Sri Lanka facilitated 100 Chinese Buddhist monks to visit Sri Lanka and 150 Sri Lankan Buddhist monks to visit China. Another delegation led by incumbent of the Lin Sang Monastery in China and vice president of the Chinese Buddhist Association, Venerable Shang Hui Thero, happened in 2015. And in May 2015, another monk, Venerable Ming Shang, visited with a 30-member delegation. He's the vice president of the Buddhist Association as well as the president of Guangdong Provincial Buddhist Association. So what is significant of all these visits is that during all these visits, these delegations, apart from visiting Sri Lanka's historical Buddhist sites, make sure to meet the Sri Lankan chief Sri Lankan monks from the three orders of Siam, Amarapura, and Ramanan sects. So these are three different Theravada Buddhist orders that are available in Sri Lanka. And these chief monks has great influence on the Sri Lankan Buddhist community. Especially the meetings with the Siam sect of Asgiri and Malwatu monasteries are especially noteworthy because these monasteries hold the custodianship of the sacred tooth relic of Buddha that is kept in Dalda Maligawa in Kandy. And this place is considered as the most valuable and holiest place for the Buddhists in the entire world. These exchange visits have paved the way for the two countries to reminisce on their long history and build good relationship and friendship among the Buddhist societies. Moreover, they open avenues for China to build fraternity within the Theravada Buddhist community. In order to facilitate such exchanges, Chinese government also encouraged its Buddhist monks to learn English language because they consider communication is key. So in 2008, China's State Bureau of Religious Affairs has initiated several programs to teach English language to its Buddhist monks. And on the other hand, China also sort of promotes the Chinese language among the Buddhist community in other countries. For instance, in during one of the visits, even a Sri Lankan Buddhist monk has mentioned the importance of learning the Chinese language in order to communicate with the Chinese Buddhist community. Even though there are no publicly available information, during my stay in China, I have met several Buddhist monks who came to China to learn Chinese language as a part of an exchange program. So basically, the Chinese government understand that China's Buddhist sect alone is less influential in the world Buddhist community compared to the Theravada Buddhism or the Tibetan Buddhism. And they also understand the importance of communication in building relationship and fraternity. So the second way that China uses this Buddhist link is engagement with the Buddhist community. But this engagement is not targeted at the general population. For instance, in the way that it is used in Nepal, for instance, using Twitter or other social media platforms, etc. It's mostly used through associations. In 2015, an association group called Sri Lanka China Buddhist Association has been established in Sri Lanka. And according to the website of this association, this association was inaugurated in the presence of Sri Lanka's chief monks from all tribes, and also when, in the presence of Venerable Minshang Thero during his visit in 2015. And the association, hello, am I audible?
Hear you. We can hear you, Chilin.
Okay, sorry.
Somebody else had to be muted.
Yeah, right. This association is embarking a journey to develop historical Buddhist friendship between Sri Lanka and China that span of the Gulf of time. This is what the website says about its purpose. And this association is engaged in various charity services and activities, such as providing dry ration, IT equipments, providing equipments and necessary funding for promoting Dharma education, which means the Buddhist education in Sri Lanka. Like, for instance, in Sri Lanka, there are Dharma schools, which perhaps you can equate it with the Sunday schools in the Christian community. These are organized and hosted by different temples. So this association provide a lot of support to these Dharma schools. And also, like other projects, like providing purified drinking water to needed communities, etc. And what is interesting is that almost all these projects are funded or sponsored by the Chinese embassy in Sri Lanka. So, and the Chinese embassy is often present in all these ceremonies organized by the association as well, which means this association gets both the financial and moral support from the Embassy of China in Sri Lanka to carry out these projects. The other thing, the third aspect is how China uses exhibitions and conferences. So as I mentioned, China hosted the World Fellowship of Buddhists General Conference in 2014. What is interesting about this conference is that the World Fellowship of Buddhists was first founded in Sri Lanka in 1950, and Sri Lanka plays an important role in the activities of this organization. In 2019, parallel to the conference on dialogue of Asian civilization, which was held in China, China also hosted an exhibition called Splendor of Asia, an exhibition of Asian civilization exhibition. So there was a unique artifact that was exhibited in this exhibition, which highlighted Sri Lanka and China's Buddhist history. And it's a replica of a stone carved stele displayed during the which was made in 1409 before Chinese Admiral Zheng He led his large fleet to the Indian Ocean region. And it has praises carved for deities in 3 languages: Chinese, Persian, and Tamil. And the original of this stela is available in the museum in Ghosal in Sri Lanka. Similarly, another exhibition was held in Sri Lanka this time in 2019 again, which was called Fashion, Culture and Maritime Silk Road Exhibition. An institute called Longhua Institute of Sri Lanka, together with the Chinese Embassy and Sri Lanka China Buddhist Association, sponsored this conference. And this Longhua Institute is an institute that specifically teach Chinese language in Sri Lanka for the general public. When Chinese scholars outside of Sri Lanka internationally speak on the Buddhist influence in Sri Lanka in the recent years, they highlight a very specific aspect, that is the symbolic infrastructure. They refer to the Lotus Tower, an infrastructure project funded by China, a 350-meter high tower in Colombo. And this tower is designed in the shape of a lotus tower. So when they usually talk about this particular project, they use it as a case to discuss how China is using its Buddhist linkage with Sri Lanka, because in the Mahayana Buddhism, there's a sutra called Lotus Sutra. They believe that this design is inspired by the Lotus Sutra. Now, Sri Lanka is majority of the Buddhists, almost all the Buddhists in Sri Lanka are not Mahayana Buddhists, they are Theravada Buddhists. So perhaps this connection can be identified as a little bit of a misplaced analysis, but definitely lotus flower symbolizes purity in the Buddhist discussion in the Theravada Buddhism as well. So I think there you can see a connection between this symbolic infrastructure that China has used. Now, when talking about China's Buddhist influence in Sri Lanka, we cannot avoid discussing how the Dalai Lama factor is dealt in the country. It is interesting to see that how Sri Lanka, despite being a Buddhist country, continues to refuse the request from His Holiness Dalai Lama to enter Sri Lanka, to visit Sri Lanka, especially to visit Sri Dalada Maligava, the most sacred place of the Buddhist all over the world. Sri Lanka has made it clear from time and time again that it will not contradict on China's position on His Holiness the Dalai Lama by refusing this request and refusing to give a visa. And also it is interesting to note how the monks, chief monks and influential chief monks in Sri Lanka avoid discussing this factor and even making any opposition to the fact that Sri Lanka is not allowing Dalai Lama to visit the country. The question is that whether China has actually succeeded in using Buddhism in Sri Lanka in its dealing so far. So China's desire to use Buddhism as a tool of soft power perhaps derived from China's desire to maintain and expand its leadership role within this part of the world and sort of portray itself as a benign and peaceful power. But to that extent, whether China's use of Buddhism has succeeded in Sri Lanka or not is not very clear. In terms of dealing with the issue of Dalai Lama, China has managed to convince the Sri Lankan government and perhaps to a certain extent some Buddhist monks and come into terms with to support China's position. But there is no evidence if this is the common acceptance of the entire Buddhist community, or whether the Buddhist community is convinced about this position. It is also unclear if the shared Buddhist identity has convinced the larger Sri Lankan Buddhist community of China as a benign power. So the recent years saw the Sri Lankans raising concerns and displeasure over China's growing economic and political array into the country. So if we take the number of protests and opposition from the public for Chinese projects as an indicator, it proves that Beijing's Buddhist diplomacy has really not been enough to attract, persuade, or appeal to the Sri Lankan community as to consider China as a peaceful power or a benign power. This could be because of the logical reality of the nature of soft power, because usually it takes time for a country to see the results in the way that they use soft power strategies. And also excessive or inappropriate use of hard power can lead to states' soft power decline. In the case of China and Sri Lanka at this point of time, I think this is exactly what is happening. When you see China massive, aggressive investments in Sri Lanka and raising pricing concerns within the Sri Lankan community, its ability to use Buddhism as a soft power tool has somewhat declined. Even though it may not be a direct outcome, one exciting consequence of China's Buddhist diplomacy in Sri Lanka is how it is impacting on India. Even though India is the birthplace of Buddhism, and even though Buddhism came to Sri Lanka from India, New Delhi has paid less attention to its Buddhist connection than its, if you compare it to the amount of attention it pays to Tamil Hindu cultural identity it shares with the Sri Lankan Tamil community. If you look at how Indian government strategize its investments in Sri Lanka, also you see a major concentration in the Tamil, ethnically Tamil dominated geographical areas. However, China's emphasis on Buddhist linkage with Sri Lanka has led India also to revisit its Buddhist heritage and strengthen its relationship based on that. So for China, using Buddhism as a soft power tool is a choice. Is not just a choice, but also a necessity at the moment. Because for years, the Chinese diplomats saw religion as a headache due to CCP's atheist policies, and Western countries have often accused China of violating religious freedom. However, now China is using Buddhism as an asset to enhance its relationship. So in that way, what we can expect in countries like Sri Lanka is China trying to engage more and more with the Buddhist community to enhance its soft power in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chilini. Thank you very much for that. I'll now turn to Dr. Shehtaj Mahmood, who's going to speak on Myanmar's Rohingya crisis and China's growing clout in Bangladesh. Shehtaj, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. This is Shehtaj Mahmood. Good morning, everyone. I am the Senior Coordinator for the Projects and Programs Division at the Institute for Policy, Advocacy and Governance. And I am glad and honored to be a part of this panel discussion today, where I get to discuss my paper, Myanmar's Rohingya Crisis and China's Growing Clout in Bangladesh. So the paper explores and digs deep in the context of China's response when it comes to the Rohingya crisis, China's connections between the tensions of Bangladesh and Myanmar, and how the Chinese engagement is perceived in Bangladesh and beyond. So to start off, the Rohingya crisis, which took place in 2017, is the fastest growing humanitarian crisis. And the international community did try to demand accountability from the Myanmar government for the brutal events, and even condemned Aung San Suu Kyi's government as they went on to the UN International Court of Justice to take back the genocide charges. Yes, but not a lot of countries, I mean, a lot of countries were in support of this, but a few countries were not in support, such as China. China actually blamed underdevelopment as one of the key issues behind the Rohingya crisis. And this was in alignment to what the Myanmar government had said. And China's 3-point plan also showed that the country was slowly moving away from its non-interference policy. When China announced its ambitious Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, which was officially incorporated in its constitution in 2017, it seemed like a very ambitious plan. This is because the BRI project is actually a reflection and expansion of the historic Silk Road, which is also popularly known as the New Silk Road, and it aims to build connectivity and cooperation between China, Asia, and Europe. So if you look at it, China has both strategic and economic interests when it comes to Myanmar. This is because the country shares a 2,000-kilometer border with Myanmar and wants to ensure peace and stability along that border. Not only that, under the BRI project, the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor houses a lot of infrastructure projects. And one infrastructure project that I would like to mention is the Kwak Piu Special Economic Zone, which is a deep sea port and which will allow China to gain direct access to the Bay of Bengal by cutting down reliance on the Strait of Malacca and even diversifying its shipping routes. But the Rohingya crisis wasn't necessarily good news for China. This is because this special economic zone was actually located in the conflict-prone state of Rakhine. So, and with the February coup taking place, when the military took power in Myanmar, it just brings back the possibility of Myanmar going back to its old days when China was its sole international supporter. So when China is investing in major infrastructure projects, this and the Rohingya crisis happening, it's not ideal, and all Chinese investments in Myanmar are actually at jeopardy and may not lead to any fruit if the crisis is not solved. So now I'm just going to play a very short AV, which was prepared by my team to give you a glimpse into the Rohingya crisis and also China's response in the events that followed. So I'm just going to share my screen. I hope, is it visible?
You can see a white screen.
Yeah. I'm just going to play it now. Thank
Good.
you. Yes, that was the AV. Actually, China holds prospects of playing an instrumental role in the mediation process between Bangladesh and Myanmar. Having China on the mediation table is actually quite an advantage for Bangladesh because China has a vested interest in sorting out the crises since it has heavy investments in Myanmar. The Sino-Bangladesh relationship is also getting stronger. This is because China has been investing and it continues to invest in Bangladesh under the BRI project. And I would also like to mention the duty-free, quota-free scheme that China has given to Bangladesh, under which Bangladesh is getting almost free tariff import privileges. So to look at the perspective, now I'll just shift to Bangladesh. Bangladesh has been quite sympathetic when it comes to the Rohingyas because the 2017 event was not a first time event. Between 1977 and 1978, about 200,000 Rohingyas fled to Bangladesh since they were denied any citizenship rights in Myanmar. And between 1980s and 1990s, the population fled to Bangladesh yet again uh, due to fear of torture, rape, and even brutal killings. But most of the time, majority of them went back. However, after the event in 2017, till date, not a single refugee has returned. Under pressure from China, Bangladesh and Myanmar did initiate a mediation process and did initiate bilateral talks to start a repatriation process. However, it failed. In 2019, another repatriation process was initiated. However, that failed as well, mainly because of Myanmar's unwillingness to take back the Rohingya people. And the international community also had their fair share of concerns. They were concerned about the safety of the Rohingya population returning to Myanmar. In fact, the Myanmar people were also scared to go back. They were scared for their lives. In 2019, yet again, another trilateral talk was initiated between China, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. But after the February coup that took place, everything came to a standstill and no progress has been made ever since. So, after two failed attempts, Bangladesh, I feel, is slowly starting to lose patience and hopes in the mediation process of China and is currently looking towards Russia because and wants to use the budding relationship between Russia and Myanmar to its advantage. Russia has also emerged as an important partner for Bangladesh because of the construction of the Rupur nuclear power plant. And if you look at it this way, the military junta, which is in power in Myanmar, wants to decrease its dependency on China. This is because they've seen the debt traps that other countries have fallen into, such as Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and others, due to heavy infrastructure projects and heavy investments. I just want to finish off by saying that the Rohingya crisis has slowly started to lose its appeal in the international area. This is because other events have emerged, such as the Taliban taking to power in Afghanistan, and with the crisis going on for 4 years or more, and with no progress inside, the international community has started losing interest in it. So this puts Bangladesh in a very tough spot because the country is spending over 1 billion USD per year in the upkeep of the Rohingya population. So, lastly, I just want to ask you, do you think a country like Bangladesh, which is one of the most densely populated countries in the world, has high poverty rates and has very limited resources, has not done to the best of its ability to support the Rohingya population, uh, And by providing them space and by providing them security, by funding infrastructure projects or other projects, social projects for the Rohingya people. And the country still continues to do so. So thank you so much. And I appreciate all of you listening to me today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I should thank all four of you for really good, detailed presentations. I mean, for me, this is proof that this is a subject which deserves detailed consideration, because unless you look into the nuance, the actual situation on the ground, you don't get a sense of really what's happening. If you just follow the media narrative, it's either of this Chinese juggernaut in South Asia, or it's, oh, nothing's working for the Chinese, the whole world is turned against Chinese being too aggressive, etc. Neither is true, as you can hear from these presentations. And so I must thank you for this very detailed, methodologically competent and nuanced picture that you've given us. I'll now turn the floor over to Constantino Xavier, our discussant, to speak about it before we then open it up to questions. In the meantime, maybe the panelists can look at the questions in the chat box, and when we come back to you, maybe you can then answer them. Tino, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon, and thank you also to ICS for hosting this special panel and giving time to us to present some of these research findings. Thanks to you, Ambassador Menon, for chairing and agreeing to do this and all your guidance, I think, in getting this project off the ground. And, like you said, I think focus on the nuance, on the empirically rich details that we're getting from these papers. And thanks to all the four paper presenters. I agree with Ambassador Menon. This is very useful to, I think, shed more light on something that is quite obscured still, which is this new, growing, not new, but increasing and growing Chinese presence in this region we call South Asia, or in India's wider neighborhood. I think if there are two themes that really stand out in all these papers, I'd say at first, something that seems to be present in all of your papers is that we're seeing, rather than, again, a big Chinese juggernaut that is monolithic, a state that is somehow just following a pre-given strategy to increase its influence, pursue its interest in South Asia. We're actually seeing a quite adaptable People's Republic of China in its diplomatic, economic, political apparatus engaging with South Asia. Adaptable to different contexts, different sectors like we've seen here, all the way from dealing with the media to dealing with political conflicts and conflict resolution, dealing with religion, something you would not have expected from, right, the traditionally atheist state. So I think on all these issues, we see an adaptable unit, an adaptable actor across sectors, across countries. And really, and this is my second point, not only adaptable, but also a learning, a reflexive actor that is not only engaging with rather unfamiliar new countries and sectors that are beyond its comfort zone, that adopt models of being, systems of culture, of thinking, and a political system in the case of South Asia in terms of a free polity and democracy. But it's adapting to that, and it's learning by engaging with these unfamiliar contexts. It's reflexive, it's intelligent, and dare I say, it's sensitive in some ways. And I can't resist making a bit of the provocative comparison with India. I mean, proximity can be a great source of illusion. That you assume that just because you are in a familiar, supposedly familiar ground, culturally, historically, right? That somehow India is familiar, knows Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, because these are countries that share, of course, tremendous histories and cultural linkages with India. But that proximity can be, I think, sometimes leading to a certain complacency, and a lack of sensitivity and a lack of, again, learning and dynamic, I think. And here, so we have a new actor in many ways. And I say new with the limitations that we've seen in recent literature. China, of course, has tremendous historical links and presence across South Asia. But there was a bit of an interregnum, let's say from the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century onwards, for the last, I'd say, 100 years, if you want, in terms of modern political, diplomatic relations and economic presence. And that now that that is being revived, it is, out of its comfort zone. It is trying to decrease that gap in terms of knowledge, in terms of economic ties with these various units in South Asia. And by doing that, it's rather reflexive, sensitive again, responsive often to its own limitation. Sometimes, through trial and error, I think it's adapting and finding its place and trying to find its place. And that fits our project very nicely at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, because besides of your 4 papers, we have, I think, 4 or 5 other ones looking at technology, looking at education. And I think the story there, from what I've seen, is quite similar. I'll go in reverse order very briefly with your comments, because all your papers are detailed, and some of which actually I've already commented on and seen. And I think they all fit the project very nicely. So there's not much I can contribute, but a few thoughts. And then before we open it up, I think to Shata, to your paper, the dilemma really is what you mentioned, the dilemma between non-interference and mediation and conflict resolution, right? You have a China that traditionally is averse to the idea of interference, interventionism, that suddenly becomes entangled in a conflict that affects its economic interests, its reputation even, because this is a periphery of China, right? Northern Myanmar in many ways, right? So it's affecting economic investments, the security of Chinese workers, of Chinese gas, oil, energy interests, trade interests, etc. So here on this, while you lay out the context, I think in a fabulous way, 2 points I leave out for suggestion for you. One is flesh out a little bit more what China's role actually was, besides the 3 points: the special envoy, the meetings he had, the meetings he did not have, right? The repatriation you mentioned very interestingly, but what was actually China's role in ensuring, mediating, offering some umbrella for that mediation and that repatriation to happen or not happen between Myanmar and Bangladesh, right? That would be very interesting. So to get those details out a little bit more would be a view. Second is, how did China engage the domestic civil society and universities, the media, and the government on this issue, right? China was keen in pleasing 2 warring factored countries, right? It was difficult to please both Myanmar and Bangladesh. In fact, that's maybe one of the reasons why India stayed away, besides capacity issues. But what was, the outreach that was done in Bangladesh? Because that's really the focus of your paper, right? Because you were seen with suspicion in Bangladesh, right? Like you mentioned, because of the positions China took internationally. But at the same time, there must have been some damage containment, I assume, from China. That would tell us more of also how Chinese diplomacy is trying to present China as a, cooperative actor. And that's difficult, right? Every country has faced this. The Americans have faced this in conflicts worldwide. The Soviets faced this during the Cold War when they would interfere and try to please different sides in domestic conflict. India has faced this in Sri Lanka and many other conflicts where it also played a role, right? So it's a very difficult game, but there's always an attempt to portray yourself as reasonable, and you use certain instruments to do that. And that would be interesting if you could help us understand that. Maybe it would be useful to look at the Chinese statements at the United Nations, the Security Council. I think there were also members at that point of the United Nations Human Rights Council. So that could give some hints. But great, Shata, I really, really enjoyed it. And I think this is a very useful paper. I'll come to the paper by Chulani. Chulani, I think your dilemma is a different dilemma, but similar, which is, how does an atheist state that has traditionally been averse to religion and even hostile to religion suddenly embrace religion as a tool to promote its interests abroad or facilitate its interests? Fascinating, right? That shift. I was thinking of, infrastructure, one of your 4 sectors. in Sri Lanka, the Chinese have a history of supporting public diplomacy infrastructure. I think the Bandar Naik Center for International Conference, the conference hall, right? I remember visiting it. It was sponsored in the 70s, if I'm not mistaken, or 80s by China. But that was a secular infrastructure, right? And suddenly here you have a variety of religious, cultural elements permeating the new infrastructure. Not only maybe the Lotus Tower, where I agree with you, it maybe not be the best example, but museums may be interesting. The National Museum in Sri Lanka, I'm not sure if I missed that in your paper, but right, there's certain financing going on there from China to promote a certain historical, religious narrative about those linkages in the past that portrays the country as a peaceful, benign partner of Sri Lanka as part of a larger history of maritime religious links. Second, on the exchanges, who's coming from China? You speak about different confessions, sects in Buddhism, right? And who's going from Sri Lanka? It'd be interesting to do a little bit of more analysis on who are the chosen ones in these delegations, and may give us some idea of who the PRC in particular is privileging or not in engaging China, because you speak that there is a sense that we have to tailor, right, our Chinese Buddhist outreach to Sri Lanka to Sri Lanka's Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism in particular. So that'd be interesting. A third, on the outreach, you speak about the Sri Lanka China Buddhist Association as an instrument or as an organization that has close relations with the embassy. But given the political turn in Sri Lanka over the last few years, and maybe decades, you could argue, or even from the 50s, right? The link between politics and the Buddhist monks and generally Buddhism and more increasingly ultra-nationalist tilt in those politics, in particular with the current government. To what extent is that driving or not the Chinese outreach, or are there links also with the political parties or some political link, hoping that engaging the monks will give you influence with, say, right, the prime minister, the president, and the ruling party there? And last, on the Dalai Lama, fascinating. I was not aware about all these politics and actually surprised to hear that Sri Lanka has taken such a strong position on that. But you speak about a very interesting possible gap between popular perceptions and governmental perceptions about this. The government may have taken a hard stance on this, but you suggest that, you know, it's not clear whether this is actually popular and supported by Sri Lankan Buddhists, right? That would maybe like to see their country have a stronger link to the Dalai Lama and to the Mahayana school of Buddhism. So great, Chulani. Looking forward to more on that. I'll come to the paper by Antara. Antara, I think your dilemma here clearly is that what should China do, right? Should it bypass India, or should it work with India and wait for India to become reasonable and try to find some new type of order in South Asia? And that dilemma is sort of playing itself out in many aspects. And your paper offers, I think, very interesting insights on how Chinese scholars, academics, analysts close to the government, obviously, are looking at this region and looking increasingly differently at the region. But I was intrigued by two things that I think are very interesting and worth, I think, fleshing out a little bit more. One is the step-by-step approach you mentioned. You know, the sequential approach again, right? Or may I say salami slicing approach in South Asia, right? That you are dealing with the easier, smaller countries first, putting India and the big issues to the side. You can't get into SAARC, so you set up your own poverty alleviation center or your own cooperative meetings with other non-India partners. But it seems that, you know, China is not following only a sequential approach, but a parallel approach, right? It's like these 4 or 5 levels that you mentioned. And it seems that on all of them, China is really pursuing them in South Asia. The bilateral track, keeping relations even with India going, hoping for a China-India +1, bringing it up occasionally. And I think that tells you again about the largest strategy of dealing with this region beyond just sort of a single strategy and single approach. And more interestingly, Antara, and you know I've mentioned this before, but I find fascinating what you just discovered on this immature democracy concept, right? The political instability, the chaos, the anarchy of democracy, of pluralism, of diversity in South Asia. This seems to be a theme that, not surprisingly, will concern or animate Chinese thinking, given its completely different political system, but when it deals with South Asia, right? China being taken for a ride, inability to control,
No, we're running out of time.
Replicate the ASEAN story. Good. I'll end on that for Antara, but I think that's really important on the democracy. Amish, I've seen your paper and I've mentioned it many times. It's really excellent, but the dilemma here seems to be that China wants to be liked but not criticized, which actually are things that go together. India is liked in Nepal, but it's also criticized all the time. And here only my suggestion is look a bit at the media relations. To ensure its soft power appeal, how has China reached out in particular to the media as the essential factor, right, to replicate its promotions, its public diplomacy, etc. I'll end here. Thanks again, and congrats all on these fantastic papers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tino. I think we're really running short of time, but maybe since I don't see any raised hands, we can go to the questions in the chat box. And I see several addressed to Antara. Maybe we can deal with those first. Antara, does Myanmar fit your framework? I think is one question. There's another one, what about BIMSTEC and ASEAN as part of India's strategy to deal with this situation? And well, somebody has asked all of you, what about Chinese private sector engagement? I think that's being dealt with in other papers in the project. Today, we've tried to give you a flavor of some of the things. But to Antara, there's also, is China's approach to South Asia here constructivist, especially when it comes to BRI and so on? Would you like to try and deal with those, Antara, before I then go on to the others? There's some questions for Chulani as well.
Right, about Myanmar, I think Dr. Shataj has, elaborated quite a bit on China-Myanmar. I think Myanmar is, of course, very important to Chinese strategy, and it is seen as a very important channel to reach the Indian Ocean. And because of the slow progress of BCIM, they have now come up with the China-Myanmar economic corridor, which is actually, again, like I mentioned, a detour. It is, just an adjustment because the BCIM did not work out. So how much economically viable, how much, it's going to benefit China or Myanmar, that question is irrelevant when the objective is to kind of build up pressure on India to, do something, to keep talking with China. So that is the main objective and not the economic viability of these projects. So, yeah, and about the the change in regime in Myanmar and the instability in Myanmar has been a constant factor in China's scheme of things, because that is going to affect its investments quite a bit. On the second question, I'm just rushing through the question. The second question is about India's responsibility. So I think this is the last thing that I'm going to talk about. India's responsibility. I think, yes, India should provide better public products, and it should ensure better spillover of India's development dividend in the region. But it needs to be on a reciprocal basis. It needs to be on the fact that both sides respect each other's interest, and it should not be under the pressure. It should not be under Chinese pressure or competing with China. So that is one last thing that I wanted to highlight. Thank you very much.
Good advice. Follow your interests rather than react. Chulani, there's a couple of questions about, I think you've answered already about whether Theravada, Mahayana, that relationship, and the lotus as a symbol. But is there anything you'd like to add?
Ambassador Menon, as you said, I think I have already answered those questions. I should admit that my information for this paper is based on publicly available information only, because I have not been able to go to Sri Lanka since I started this project. So from what I see in the public media, according to what I see in the public media, there's no issue with regard to whether it's Mahayana. Plus, I think Chinese form of Buddhism is not even Mahayana. It's a form of Buddhism which has a lot of Chinese characteristics influenced by Confucianism, Taoism, etc. But anyway, there has been no issue with regard to that. And and then about the Lotus Tower, again, the symbol of lotus, I agree that India and Sri Lanka share the same symbol. Obviously, the religion, Buddhism went to other parts of the world from India. India is the birthplace of Buddhism. So definitely you see the similar symbolism in this aspect. So I think that is quite normal. So with regard to, I want to thank Tino for your comments also, right? And with regard to the suggestions you have made also, I will try how I can address this within the limits of doing this while in Sri Lanka and not having a physical, physical access to people whom I would like to have a chat with about this.
Well, we have 1 minute left, and I suppose what can we squeeze in here? There's one question, maybe Shahtaj, if has India tried to mediate in the Rohingya crisis?
When basically in 2017, India avoided any mention of the displacement of the Rohingya when Prime Minister Modi visited Myanmar, and Bangladesh was not happy with it. And India did launch Operation Insaniyat to aid the Rohingya population after that event. But I think ever since, India has been very cautious and they have not been involved in the mediation process. I think Bangladesh was hoping that ASEAN would be involved in the mediation process, but as of now, due to recent developments, it puts Bangladesh back in a tough spot again. So
thank you. Thank you very much. Amish, I think you've been saved by the bell, because I had actually questions of my own that I wanted to ask you, but I won't even try to summarize this wonderfully rich panel and the presentations that the four of you have made. Thank you very much for this. You've certainly given us a lot of material to think about, but also, I think, suggested further lines of inquiry, which is very, very useful. I'm sure I speak for everybody, and we have something like 230 participants right now. I'm sure I speak for everybody when I say thank you very much, and let's give them a big round of virtual applause. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon. Let me conclude this session by thanking the chair, Mr. Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, and the discussant, Dr. Constantino Xavier, and the four panelists for joining us. It was an extremely productive session. I would also like to thank our digital partner, The Print, for covering our sessions. The video recordings of all our sessions will be available on our ICS YouTube channel. We shall now have a short break and resume at 11:45 for our next thematic session on the topic, International Trade and Foreign Policy. Please note that the meeting room will remain open for the next session. We would encourage all of you to stay back for the next session with your videos and audios off. Thank you for logging in.